Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to have such impressive speakers that I will be moderating today. So we've had a little introduction there from Charlie. I'll give a slightly more extensive introduction because these are people whose CVs will make all of us feel inadequate. Jim Messina, I'm assuming everyone will have heard of, is a political advisor who was the White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations under Barack Obama, and also the campaign manager for Obama's 2012 re-election campaign. And one of the things I think we'll be talking about today is the interaction of technology and politics. And obviously, this is something that he is hugely knowledgeable about. That campaign, the 2012 race, was described by Eric Schmidt as the best run campaign ever. And largely that was what he was talking about there, was that interaction of technology and politics. Vanessa Neumann is a Venezuelan-American diplomat, author, and political theorist. She is also a current consultant to UN Women. She wrote the book Blood Profits, How American Consumers Unwittingly Fund Terrorists. And she's now an ambassador for the acting Venezuelan president to the United Kingdom. So I couldn't imagine two better speakers, and welcome both of you. I thought the logical place for us to start, and it's not a particularly optimistic question, but given what we're seeing in the world at the moment, what we've seen over the last 5 years, is liberal democracy dying? And Jim, do you want to start, and then we'll bring in Vanessa?
Sure. Well, Rosamund, thank you for the introduction. This is a pleasure to be here. In the past 7 years, I've been able to help 12 presidents and prime ministers around the world get elected. And, I don't think it's dying at all, but what you're seeing is some severe growing pains, right? This economic dislocation that we have seen around the world and these economic challenges create political unrest. And you add to that the rise of technology. People no longer think that there's, jobs and an education future for their kids, and they start to look at different forms of expression. And what we're seeing all over the world is a rise of populism and nationalism on both the left and the right, which is, handled different ways by different political leaders, but really is a reflection of this anger voters are feeling. And they want some answers to questions that aren't easily answerable. And those answers are: what does the future look like? What is an economic future? How does technology affect us? You all saw it in Brexit. We saw it in the rise of Donald Trump. We're seeing it all over. Vanessa's seeing it in Venezuela. And this is providing real challenges. And sometimes, in some places, voters and governments have gone towards the other polar opposite of democracy, and they've said, okay, we may be willing to trade some freedoms for some security. And those choices are, in my opinion, one of the biggest challenges of the next decade. What kind of liberties are we willing to give away? What kind of privacy are we willing to give away? What kind of technology rights are we willing to give in trade for safety from terrorism, safety from privacy, safety from government? And these we're wrestling with every single day in liberal democracies. I think we'll get the right answers. I think, as Martin Luther King said, the arc of always bends towards freedom, and we'll continue to bend that arc. But in the past few years, that arc has looked really difficult.
One thing that obviously you know a huge amount about is the interaction of technology and politics. And people tend to think of the 2012 election in the US, presidential election, as one where it was used for, people tend, I'm generalizing, to think of it being used in a positive way. Obviously, right. We've now become aware of it being used in a very negative way, potentially. What do you think the challenges there are, and how do we make sure that technology is an asset rather than something that's damaging to democracy?
Yeah, look, like all things, there's goods and bads, right? The bad part is, in most of the elections we've worked in the past 5 years, we've seen foreign actors attempting to persuade voters using technology. And people think that it's their neighborhood bloke on Facebook, and it's not really. It's a foreign actor trying to change technology and use it to persuade. On the other hand, young voters around the world are 3 times more likely to be involved in politics, to talk about politics than any generation ever. And the reason is because they use technology every day on Facebook, on Twitter, on Snap, on a variety of platforms. They use it to really begin to affect change. And you're seeing that no place better than my country right now in the aftermath of the Floyd disaster and killing 2 weeks ago in Minnesota. You've really seen people use technology to begin to say enough is enough. You saw the National Football League players tape a video on technology that completely changed the position of the NFL in 24 hours. You're seeing people use technology to organize themselves politically to fight things like climate change and for immigration reform and those types of things that are really changing things. And so there's goods and bads. And I think you're seeing this, the internet's only 20 years old. Rosamund and I are very young at heart, but we remember a time when there wasn't every day on the internet, right? And that was a different world. And everyone says, oh, back then it was easy. And it's true, it was easier. But it's now super easy to get involved and talk about politics. People like in Vanessa's country, Venezuela, are using Twitter and Facebook and even just texting to organize themselves. And the government tries to shut that down. They find a new way to do it. And they find ways to get out. 30 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to do that. And because of technology, you can do that. So I am incredibly hopeful about politics because of technology. But in the short term, it's certainly having real challenges. And, the platforms are getting a lot of grief, as they sometimes should, for not, rising quickly enough to the challenge. And we can talk about that.
While we haven't got Vanessa, I might as well ask the question she can't answer as a diplomat. So your prediction for the 2020 election in November, the presidential election, Trump versus Biden, what do you think is going to happen and what would you like to see happen?
Well, what I'd like to see happen is Donald Trump fucking lose the election. What I would... I do believe President Trump will be defeated in November. I don't think it's a slam dunk that some people around the world currently think. I've done a couple winning campaigns in the UK, and part of what I always say in the UK is don't believe the polls. And right now, all of my friends in the UK send me every poll every day and say, oh God, Trump's going to lose, Trump's going to lose. A reminder, there wasn't a poll showing Trump winning last time. I helped David Cameron get reelected, and there was no poll that showed him winning the majority we end up getting. So I think, we have 50 days before the election. You'll see the polls bounce around a bunch, but I think President Trump has 2 challenges that are unprecedented. One, we're now in a recession in the U.S. No president since 1924 has gotten reelected in the middle of a recession. And then 2, the COVID response has been unbelievably badly handled. And now 60% of voters believe that he has poorly handled that. Those 2 combinations, I think, make it very, very difficult for the president to get reelected. And I go to bed every night praying that that is true.
Right.
Vanessa, I'm very glad we've got you back there.
Thank you.
Please chip in.
I did want to add a little bit, there's another question. I mean, the healthcare system in the United States is, shall we say, it's not the National Health Service. So having a pandemic puts extra strain and I think would highlight any sense of inequality. So that poses other extra challenges for any president. And also, I think we're some time away. We won't see it by November, but the response to COVID in terms of the economic response is likely to highlight socioeconomic inequalities, which means further polarization of the electorate. So I think just from a technocratic standpoint, those would also be factors in any election campaign. I won't say.
I'd love to explore that further because obviously we're in the middle of a pandemic. It's quite hard to predict what effects it might have, but quite rightly across the world, people are saying that this is going to exacerbate existing inequalities. We've actually already seen some element of that. Mm-hmm. How do you see that playing out, given that we're looking forward? What are going to be what's going to be the call for change, or what is going to change out of this? Could we see a big reshaping of well, the problems around inequality and actually something that addresses them?
Well, I think that, so I think things like a pandemic, which does not respond to threats or bullying or negotiation, but really only responds to very strong institutions, is really, that this should be a boon for stronger command and control, stronger institutions, and stronger government, rather than just have it centered around, as I was saying, the caudillo or one individual personality. It will cause some addressing for generalized healthcare systems. There's going to be a greater call for that, I think, around the world, and security and communications.
What you're seeing all over the world in the countries we operate in is the role of government changing, right? Now, voters in the EU and the US and other places are now, 70% of them saying the government should have a bigger role in the post-COVID crisis world. And I think, we're going to fundamentally reassess that as well as a role in the economics. You've seen governments do very different things. Again, back to my struggling country, what you're seeing is all the leaders in the European Union, their poll numbers went up in reaction to the COVID crisis in the short term. In the United States, Trump's numbers have fallen apart. But at the same time, voters think that government needs a bigger role. They just don't want President Trump to be the head of the government while it has a role.
Right.
And in terms of, we touched on this earlier, but foreign actors impacting elections. We've got obviously the US presidential election coming up. How much do you expect that to be a factor this autumn?
It already is. Google informed both Trump and Biden campaigns last week that their senior campaign officials had been attempted hacking by more than one foreign government. This has been going on for over 10 years. I remember in 2008, when then Senator Obama was running, the CIA and NSA came and briefed me and said, you have been hacked, as has the McCain campaigns. As I said earlier, most of the campaigns we have done around the world, foreign actors are participating in this and attempting to both hack and then figure out how to sow dissension. In some places, they want one or two of the leaders to win. Mostly, they just want chaos and they want to sort of undermine democracy for their own uses. And it becomes really important for there to be real coordination between the national security apparatuses and the platforms. I think Facebook has rightfully gotten some severe criticisms for the way they handled 2016 and the way they are not handling 2020. And I continue to be very worried about it.
Yeah, I think the national security aspect, something I also wanted to mention with respect to COVID-19, the whole concept of national security is also changing, as it should, right? I mean, it should change in response to challenges. One aspect of the pandemic and institutions is, perhaps you want to have your face mask made in Latin America. I'm going to pitch for Latin America rather than China. Have them have either, or like the way you have your military uniforms made by other members of the Five Eyes, intelligence circles, you don't have it outsourced to other countries. We might consider things like key medical supplies or key crisis management aspects that should not be produced with other countries, by other countries with whom we are often in conflict in a number of other scenarios. And also from a national security, this stirring up of rage. So as you saw in the protests, as you're seeing in the protests around the world, you have legitimate complaints, people exercising the legitimate constitutional right. Then you have, some people looting, lagged onto that. And then you have, agitators. And with that, the disinformation campaigns and misinformation campaigns online, that trigger all those opportunities in order to trigger suspicion of the leadership, of the institutions, of your country. And I know this as a Venezuelan, we see this every single day in our social media. And I think those concepts of somehow managing the disinformation campaign that unleashes rage and reactions that are beyond the original source of complaint, let's put it that way. And that's a very fine line. Who defines that? And yet that's now a national security issue, as well as supply chains, for crisis management.
What do you expect the result of the current Black Lives Matter protests in the US that have obviously gone global? What do you think the impact of those will be, first on the election this year, the presidential election, but then also more broadly on society?
Well, more broadly on society, I'm actually very optimistic. I think you're seeing for the first time, across races, across socioeconomic spectrums, people rising together to say we need fundamental change. It is no longer okay to have a slogan and a hashtag and not have real response to it. So yesterday, the majority in Congress released a very detailed plan to pass legislation this year to make real fundamental changes in some of the socioeconomic issues Vanessa talked about. I think that's incredibly important. Even the Republican majority in the Senate has said they're going to move on some pieces of that. And I think you could actually start to fundamentally look at some of these issues, why African Americans have much lower health care, why they have much, bigger incarceration rates. We could start changing the way we police and do some of the things that you all do in the EU that make more sense in community policing and some other things. We can start to have fundamental change in this, and I'm very optimistic. I think in the political realm, what I hope happens is you see historic turnout in the elections. And right now we are as political and as engaged as a society as we have been. The 2018 midterm elections, our version of your by-elections, Rosamund, were the highest turnout in America in 102 years. And if we have that same turnout in November, I think you'll see sweeping changes at the ballot box and hopefully some real fundamental change in the way we deal with some of these issues come next year.
And Vanessa, what do you think more globally with this? And can I just also encourage people to post questions that will be asked in the second session? But Vanessa, globally, what do you think it means?
What do I think? I'm sorry, you cut out.
The impact of the protest globally. Sorry.
Well, I think, as I said, I think it does force people to question what do you want out of government. And I know I keep coming back to this because it was also the core of my work as a political theorist, which is, that would always be day one of the courses I would teach is, what kind of life. So we have a concept of that government should give you the tools to lead a life that you have reason to value. So what are those tools? To what extent does it have to be, pro one religion or another religion? I mean, and I think there's a bit of room for that in to vary according to culture. I do think that there's room for that. But what are the tools? It has to give you equality of opportunity, which is education for all, access to that education, a transportation system that gets you to school or gets you to work, some to safeguard your health care, and then also to find that in all of this discussion, also that while you want the rights of the different groups respected, right? Black Lives Matter, Venezuelans have been saying Venezuelan lives matter because we're being run over by APVs of the National Guard yesterday, that we should just accept that there should be a baseline of human dignity that, kneeling on necks is not a good idea and should not be tolerated. And then how do we enforce that, and how do we come around to not just have ever smaller niches of try and assert their rights, but also have those rights asserted within a broader rules of engagement, which is really what the government should be a framework for the rules of engagement and exchange of protections and rights, and not just cruise along, but really have that conversation. And social media can do that, but then you also have to carry that conversation to find a way to connect. And the algorithms of social media tend to put you further and further into a cocoon, further and further into a pot where you only hear an echo chamber. So we're also going to have that conversation. The way we need about the mutual rights is how do we also use those algorithms to have more of a cross exchange of information and values and conversation, rather than just only speak to other people who agree with us.
So we've got about a minute left. So what I'm going to ask is, in about 30 seconds, can both of you make a prediction for 2030? Since we're looking 10 years into the future, can you make a political prediction for what you think the world might look like in 2030?
Go ahead, Vanessa. I've been going first.
No, I was going to say you go, Jim. No, I was going to say you go. I think it looks. I think it looks a lot more. Far more digital, obviously. Maybe not obviously. I mean, the trends are the trends that we're seeing is the digitalization of the world. That we also have to reconsider now that I think the COVID-19 will have triggered. It was a conversation we're already having, but now we're really going to have it. That things like tech are part of critical infrastructure, right? And it's critical infrastructure for the rural communities, for socioeconomic inclusion, right? So it's not just roads and things. It's the concept of infrastructure. Getting a drone out to medicine to your ranch in Montana is possibly part of critical infrastructure. And social inclusion. And I think I think that's the primary thing. And then the renewable energy and decarbonization is going to shift investment and is going to shift what countries rise and fall.
Jim?
I think people will look back and say the COVID crisis was the single most important event of our lifetime because it drastically sped up the acceleration to a tech economy. And we will still be struggling with that politically and socially about where you create jobs in the tech world, how you bring along the rest of the economy to build that. I think government will play a much bigger role in our education and the way we think about education and climate change. I think we'll come back in 10 years and say the three most important things we can do is get the energy world right, the education world, and have fair rules in tech.
Thank you both very much. I think Charlie's going to come in now. Maybe? Yeah, perfect.
Fantastic, Rosamund. So thank you all for a magnificent discussion. You certainly covered the spectrum from politics to the technology in politics and obviously what's going on in Venezuela. That was a really rich and insightful conversation. And Jim, it was fascinating to hear your views on the US election as well. So that brings day 2 on the leadership stage to a close. I want to thank you, our audience, and remind you that if you go to the app now and you select what's happening, you'll see the breakout Q&A session for this session. And please go and join it. There's going to be another half hour from 7 until 7:30, and then we're wrapped for the day. Thank you very much for being with us, and thank you to the panel.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.